If you were to open the first page of Vladimir Nabokov's 1955 novel Lolita, you would find possibly one of the most well-written introductions in modern literature. Lolita, light of my life, fire of my loins, my sin, my soul. Lolita, the tip of the tongue taking a trip of 3 steps down the palate to tap, at 3, on the teeth. Lolita. She was low, plain low, in the morning, standing 4 feet 10 in one sock. She was Lola in slacks. She was Dolly at school. She was Dolores on the dotted line. But in my arms, she was always Lolita. The controversial but brilliant Lolita would attract a whole new audience to the works of Nabokov when this novel gained traction in the mid to late 1950s. Suddenly, an audience was exposed to a writer whose prose was unlike any others at the time. Many readers were astounded that a man in his second language could do so much and at such a high level with his prose. And whilst critics and the public chalked this rich prose up to a superior intellect, an ability to work hard, or just natural talent, Nabokov knew there was another factor at play. A factor he would later admit to in an interview with the BBC, published in the now defunct literary magazine The Listener on November 22, 1962. When pressed, Nabokov revealed this factor as being a type of freakish gift, the gift itself being the ability to see colour in letters. Whilst Nabokov never explicitly said the term, the freakish gift he had had since childhood was in fact synesthesia. Synesthesia is a rare neurological condition wherein a person's senses combine. These combinations can appear in many forms. For example, hearing colour in music, feeling shapes whilst eating, or like in Nabokov's case, seeing colour in letters. And that's just to name 3 iterations of many. The sensation of synesthesia is one that is as real to the person experiencing it as whatever sense initially kickstarted the reaction. For example, if someone were to see colour when listening to music, that colour would form in front of them in hues that looked like they could be reached out to and touched, as opposed to just forming in the mind. As a condition, not a lot is known about synesthesia. It is not considered to be an illness, disorder, or any psychological problem of any type, despite the sensation being involuntary. Instead, synesthesia is simply a genetic trait, as detrimental to the lives of those who have it as the eye colour, height, or hair colour passed down to you is in your daily life. As is the case with the roulette of genetics, however, the cards we are given by our parents must be used to their full advantage. And when looking back at some of the most influential artists in history, there is evidence to suggest that they had been wielding their synesthesia as an advantageous tool to creating some of the greatest art ever produced. But before delving straight into that, let's have a look at the 200+ year history of synesthesia. While synesthesia is thought to be a condition residing within humans way back to our caveman days, the actual first account of a person with synesthesia was written by the English philosopher and physician John Locke in 1690, when he recounted a blind man who described the colour scarlet as the sound of a trumpet. This can be found in Locke's An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. 20 years following this description, a man by the name of Thomas Woolhouse would himself report on a blind man also viewing colour as sound. Cases of synesthesia would similarly be recounted throughout the coming decades, yet with no further explanation beyond the symptoms. For example, in a letter written by Henry David Thoreau in 1845 to Ralph Waldo Emerson, Thoreau tells of a question asked of him by Emerson's daughter that had surprised him, as he had asked whether Thoreau used coloured words. The daughter, Ellen Emerson, would become the first photographed person with synesthesia. Just under 40 years following this correspondence, Vincent van Gogh would himself display symptoms of synesthesia when writing a letter to his brother. In the letter, Van Gogh listed out a bunch of painters, likening their styles to that of musical instruments. Some time ago you rightly said that every colourist has his own characteristic scale of colours. This is also the case with black and white. It is the same after all. One must be able to go from the highest light to the deepest shadow, and this with only a few simple ingredients. Some artists have a nervous hand at drawing, which gives their technique something of the sound peculiar to a violin. For instance, Lamoud, Demire, Langson. Others, for example, Gavarni and Bodmer, remind one more of piano playing. Do you feel this too? Millet is perhaps a stately organ. Van Gogh's particular cross-wiring of the senses is known as chromesthesia, and whilst we never know whether Van Gogh actually had it, I think it's fair to say he probably did. Chromesthesia is one of the 2 most common examples of synesthesia, the second being grapheme colour synesthesia, the type that Nabokov has. Poet Arthur Rimbaud was thought to share the same type of synesthesia as Nabokov, due in part to a famous poem Rimbaud wrote in 1871 called The Vowels, wherein he detailed each colour he saw for each letter. Interest in the studies of synesthesia seemed to have hit their peak between 1880 and 1920, a time where introspection and the subjective experience were viewed as worthy of being studied. However, due to two factors going into the mid-20th century, synesthesia seemed to just lose interest to everybody altogether. The first factor was simply the fact that synesthesia wasn't harmful. It wasn't causing anyone any issues, for the most part, and therefore the demand for an understanding of it was not there. Secondly, the subjective nature of synesthesia clashed with the growing popularity of behaviorism, spearheaded by American psychologist B.F. Skinner. In a nutshell, behaviorism reduced the human experience down to stimulus and response. Introspection and the unconscious were no longer in vogue in the psychology world, thus pushing synesthesia to the very back of the queue of importance and intrigue. This overall dismissal of synesthesia, and any conditions similar in their subjective nature, caused many people to live their lives in the belief that they were mad, and typically synesthetes became embarrassed by their crossed senses. However, by the 1980s, one man, through a chance encounter, would find himself on a mission to bring synesthesia back into the realm of study, all on his own. On February 10, 1980, American neurologist Richard E. Kajtowicz attended a dinner party hosted by an art teacher called Michael Watson. Unbeknownst to Richard, this normal enough social gathering would lead to an obsession with synesthesia when Watson, in the company of only himself and Richard, was slurping some sauce for his soon-to-be-served meal and said, "There aren't enough points in the chicken." Unknown to everyone, including even Watson, he had synesthesia. Evidently, Watson knew he could feel shapes when tasting something, but he never knew it had a name, and that other people had it too. Embarrassed, Watson described to Richard how differing tastes produced differing shapes, and that he liked his chicken pointy. That was how he knew it was ready to serve. Richard took an immediate interest in Watson's synesthesia, and this chance happening ignited many essays, a textbook, and the content of Richard's most famous work, The Man Who Tasted Shapes, which was published in 1993. The book itself, rather than being a boring study, is presented as a half biography, half detective novel. You watch as Richard's fascination with synesthesia leads him down a path of discovery in many areas. He develops a close bond with Watson, experiences a tremendous pushing back from his colleagues, and by the end, his own personal beliefs regarding rationality and objectivity are challenged. Richard and Watson's initial encounter is relayed in the book, with Richard referring to Watson's house as being similar to the man's senses. Just as there were no walls between the rooms of his house, I knew that Michael had no walls between his senses. Just as his rooms flowed into each other, so too taste, touch, movement, and colour meshed together seamlessly in his brain. The discovery of Watson and his synesthesia ignited within Richard a new way of thinking about the brain and how to study it. Richard believed that humans had become too reliant on machines to do the diagnosing for them, causing some people to not trust their own experiences. In the case of Watson's synesthesia, Watson had been nervous going through the tests, as he believed he would be proven or accused of not having the condition in the first place, thus leaving him even more ashamed than he had been before. Richard had taken issue with this growing mentality and wanted to change it. The individual person was no longer worthy of study. The individual, in fact, came to be seen as increasingly irrelevant, and so were any feelings, opinions, beliefs, or personal background. These things constituted the messy subjective part of the human psyche. The so-called learned professions ran away from the content of individual minds. With no time to waste, Richard began running tests on Watson. These tests would differ in their intensity. They began with Richard giving Watson varying flavours and noting down what he could feel, taking depressants and stimulants to see their effect on Watson's synesthesia, to Richard then strapping Watson into a machine in order to measure localised brain metabolism during a synesthetic experience using radioactive gas. In later experiments, Richard had discovered that depressants, such as amyl nitrate or alcohol, enhanced Watson's synesthetic experiences, whereas stimulants suppressed them. When hooked up to the machine, Richard found that synesthesia likely resided within the limbic system on the left hemisphere. When doing the test, he noticed the cortex shut down, whilst Watson had a synesthetic experience. To have such a seemingly small sense have such an impact baffled Richard. Richard concluded that the limbic system, where emotion and memory are processed, may potentially hold a far greater influence over the cortex than the cortex was once thought to have over the limbic system, the cortex being objectivity and rationality. As well as this, in studying Watson and delving into what literature he could on the subject, Richard wrote up 5 criteria to diagnose someone with synesthesia. The stories of synesthetes sounded so similar that I concluded it could be diagnosed by features in the history. It could be confirmed by meeting 5 diagnostic criteria. The 5 criteria were as follows. Number 1, synesthesia is involuntary but must be elicited. Number 2, synesthesia is projected. Number 3, synesthesia perceptions are durable, discrete and generic. Number 4, synesthesia is memorable. And number 5, synesthesia is emotional and noetic. Richard's findings regarding synesthesia would be published in the 1980s within essays and textbooks, with The Man Who Tasted Shapes being released in the early 1990s, as aforementioned. Upon the publication of these essays, Richard was surprised to find that he had received many letters from synesthetes who were thanking him for both validating their experiences and even bringing the name synesthesia to their attention. It is worth noting that many people experiencing synesthesia were afraid to speak out on their experiences due to a fear of pushback. However, now that Richard, a doctor who could speak on such a topic with authority, was discussing the condition, people were no longer afraid to admit to their synesthetic experiences. And this included Watson too, who had been insecure about his synesthesia all of his life, mainly due to childhood bullying. Richard brought the condition back into the light and preemptively shot down any preconceived notions regarding it, as he knew people would look at a cross-wiring of senses as being a burden, when in fact synesthesia seemed to be a deeply personal and almost revelatory feeling. Our extreme difficulty in comprehending synesthetic experience and our presumption of what is normal leads to the false assumption that synesthesia must be a burden, or somehow interfere with normal thinking. By analogy, blind persons would be justified asking why sighted individuals are not bothered by having to constantly see everything. Are we not driven to distraction by a constantly changing visual jumble? It seems that we are all able to handle our own subjectivity and make sense of our own experience, even though it may be quite different from someone else's subjective experience. Synesthesia is a way of allowing an unconscious to unfold in a way words could never do. Whatever way a synesthete's senses might cross, the experience remains a deeply personal, emotional, and subjective experience that only a select few get to have. It is an experience closer to our mammalian ancestors than any reasoned, objective, rational mind could envision. No words could come close. Synesthesia is the most immediate and direct kind of experience I've ever encountered. It is sensual and concrete, not some intellectualized concept pregnant with meaning. It emphasizes limbic processes which break through to consciousness. It's about feeling and being, something more immediate than analyzing what is happening and talking about it. The immediacy and simplicity of it go directly to the heart of the matter. In a 1962 interview with the BBC, Nabokov had elaborated on his admission of seeing colour in letters of the alphabet. To him, the alphabet was a cacophony of colour that not only held the letters necessary to build the words for his novels, but also to help him inject them with vibrant life. In the interview, Nabokov refers to the condition as colour hearing, and talks about his conversations with psychologists who told him the condition stems from childhood, but is often drowned out over time by, in his words, stupid parents. Following up with this, the interviewer asked Nabokov to explain the hues surrounding his own initials. V is a kind of pale, transparent pink. I think it's called technically quartz pink. This is one of the closest colours that I can connect with the V, and the N, on the other hand, is a greyish, yellowish oatmeal colour. Interestingly, Nabokov's wife also had synesthesia. When the two would discuss the colours they saw in letters, their paths did not cross often. They saw the same colour for 2 or 3, as Nabokov recounted. However, they later found their son to have inherited the gift himself, and when asking what colours he saw in the letter M, he replied purple, which was a mix between the differing colours of the two parents, those being pink for Vladimir and blue for his wife, Vera. As well as Nabokov detailing his synesthesia in this BBC interview, he would also reference it in his 1951 autobiography, Speak Memory. Nabokov also makes mention of the fact that he can hear the colour when orally formed. The following quote is long but necessary, so just bear with me for a second, as it acts to lay out the alphabetic rainbow of Nabokov. Perhaps hearing is not quite accurate, since the colour sensation seems to be produced by the very act of my orally forming a given letter while I imagine its outline. The long A of the English alphabet, and it is this alphabet I have in mind farther on, unless otherwise stated, has for me the tint of weathered wood, but a French A evokes polished ebony. This black group also includes hard G, vulcanized rubber, and R, a sooty rag being ripped, oatmeal N, noodle limp L, and the ivory-backed hand mirror of O take care of the whites. Passing on to the blue group, there is steely X, thundercloud Z, and huckleberry K. Since a subtle interaction exists between sound and shape, I see Q as browner than K, while S is not the light blue of C, but a curious mixture of azure and mother of pearl. Adjacent tints do not merge, and diphthongs do not have special colours of their own, unless represented by a single character in some other language. In the green group, there are alder leaf F, the unripe apple of P, and pistachio T. Dull green combined somehow with violet is the best I can do for W. The yellows comprise various E's and I's, creamy D, bright golden Y, and U, whose alphabetical value I can express only by brassy with an olive sheen. In the brown group, there are the rich rubbery tone of soft G, paler J, and the drab shoelace of H. Finally, among the reds, B has the tone called burnt sienna by painters, M is a fold of pink flannel, and today I have at last perfectly matched V with rose quartz. The beginning of Lolita is inundated with the letter L. Maybe this was purely a choice born out of simply wanting to call the main character Lolita and just so happening to have a lot of L beginning words to use that would simultaneously convey Humbert's obsessiveness whilst producing an opening that rolls off the tongue. Maybe so. But is it also possible that the synesthetic and emotional relation with a letter such as L inspired the name Lolita? Synesthetes relate emotional reactions to their personal hues. If so in Nabokov's case, maybe the noodle limp whites of the letter L inspired a feeling within Nabokov that he felt necessary to use in order to convey a certain emotion in the text. The emotion itself could be many things: purity, innocence, virginity, etc. But if we were to take the common associations with the colour white, it may explain why Nabokov chose Lolita for the name of the underage love interest of Humbert. If we took this same theory and applied it to Humbert, we can see that H is a letter Nabokov associated with brown. The symbolic meanings of the colour brown, in my mind at least, do not come so quickly as they would for a colour like red, blue or green. Yet, from my research, I have seen brown to suggest loneliness, isolation and sadness. It could be a coincidence, or maybe Nabokov was taking these into account. That is, if the emotional response produced by these hues were consistent with our own responses to these colours. They could just be random. And so, if L represented a hue that invaded Nabokov with feelings akin to love, is it possible the constant use of the L in the aforementioned introduction to Lolita was a way to keep that hue glowing, like the consistent blowing on a fire to retain its ember? Remember, the book is written from Humbert's perspective, so the constant pounding of L could be a further sign of Humbert's obsessiveness, as he attaches a piece of L and the feeling associated within the hue exuding from the letter into as many descriptions of Lolita as he can. Maybe synesthesia had even more of a role to play than we'll ever know. It is a secret language only available to Nabokov. The other similarly cross-wired synesthetes may have their own hues bubbling on the letter, but in no way could that hue bring on an emotion, an experience, a feeling that would fall directly in line with its creator. For us normal people, the people whose senses sadly formed walls around their positions, we can only appreciate the letters for what they are when they fall in line correctly with the others.